Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support. Well, today we're going to start a fun new series entitled Myth or Reality, in which we look at popular perceptions of Calvin and ask, are they accurate and are they fair? Today we're going to be looking at the common perception that Calvin was a tyrant. A tyrant is usually defined as a cruel and oppressive ruler, and that's the definition I'm going to be using in this episode. And you can see the perception of Calvin as a tyrant all over the place on the internet. So I found a blog post that had a picture of Calvin with the words "wanted for murder, John Calvin." I've got to love a bit of drama. The New York Times wrote in 1906, John Calvin was not a pleasant man, and his biography is not pleasant reading. Historian Will Durant describes Calvin's Institutes as the most eloquent, fervent, lucid, logical, influential, and terrible work in all the literature of religious revolution. But perhaps the most hilarious presentation of Calvin as a tyrant can be found in the popular children's trilogy, His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. In the book, John Calvin actually becomes the Pope. Can you imagine that? And then Calvin moves the Catholic Church from Rome to Geneva, where he institutes the consistory to control every aspect of human life. So very 1984 dystopian vibes. And he even goes on to create the office of assassin for the church, which I thought was quite cool. But all of this is to say, the perception that Calvin was a kind of sinister, manipulative tyrant is endlessly repeated, isn't it? So what's going on? Is Calvin some kind of ogre, some kind of moral monster, casting this shadow over Western history? These kinds of questions and debates are what makes studying John Calvin so unashamedly entertaining. He's a person about whom it's very hard to stay neutral, and therefore it's always interesting to study him. One thing that does become clear, though, when you really start to study Calvin is just how wildly inaccurate that popular perception is that he was a tyrant. That doesn't mean Calvin should be hero worshipped either, because he's got flaws and they're too conspicuous for that, and we'll have other episodes in which we can look at Calvin's personality. But the claim that Calvin was a tyrant is mistaken on a number of levels and is, in my opinion, actually selectively unfair when you compare him with other people from the same period of time. So why is Calvin not a tyrant? Well, firstly, he didn't hold any political office in Geneva. Calvin was actually excluded from citizenship for most of his life because he was French. And the city council of Geneva were actually hostile to any loss of their power to a foreigner like Calvin. So while some historians might debate the degree to which Calvin's influence on Geneva was positive, they don't argue that he was some kind of dictator, and that's because it's just not historically accurate. And certainly prior to 1555, Calvin's wishes are frequently thwarted by the city council, much to his annoyance. But secondly, nearly all of Calvin's biographers recognise that this accusation that Calvin was a tyrant is not historically accurate. While some historians like Calvin more than others, most Calvin scholars recognise that the reality is much more complex than Calvin being a tyrant. There's a well-known phenomenon in historical research where people look down into history a bit like a well, but because they aren't self-aware, they just see their own image reflected back at them. And I think it's possible to do this with Calvin too, and this sort of inaccurate stereotype of Calvin is probably a case in point. People decide, either because they haven't taken the care to really read or study Calvin closely, or because they see Calvin as kind of a poster boy for something that they don't like, that Calvin must be the manipulative tyrant that he's portrayed as in popular representations. This is why studying Calvin is demanding, but it's also great fun, because there are so many layers of interpretation and drama. Over 500 years of arguing about him, that actually uncovering the true Calvin, apart from the various accommodations that his supporters and his enemies make about him, can be very, very hard to do. Even today, the first exposure that many people have to Calvin is, people say, well, he's the bloke who argued for predestination, isn't he? Even though predestination takes up a very small section of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, and even though all of the reformers, not to mention Augustine and Aquinas, also believed in predestination, he's somehow become this poster boy for a kind of harsh, judgmental predestinarianism. And so, of course, it stands to reason, if that is how most people first hear about Calvin, that it's going to take some work to have that perception changed. And if you think about it, once you have that perception of Calvin, it's only a hop, skip and a jump into thinking that he was a tyrant, especially when you throw into the mix stereotypes about the consistory in Geneva and, to be frank, complete hysteria about the whole Servetus episode. So Servetus was a slightly unhinged humanist scholar who was very sadly burned at the stake in Geneva. But as we will see when we do our deep dive series on Servetus, Calvin actually comes out of that episode looking not perfect, but pretty good. It's the city council who decide to burn Servetus, not Calvin. And it's Calvin who, once they push for burning, tries to change to a more merciful death by the sword. But anyway, I'll come back to that another time. My hope is that this podcast will contribute, if only a bit, to understanding Calvin better. And it's worth saying, if there is a dominant theme in Calvin's thought, many scholars have opted for union with Christ as the dominant motif that runs throughout Calvin's thought, not predestination. As I say, we'll get into that in more detail in the future, but I just wanted to flag that. But it does seem that first impressions die hard. And if the first thing people hear about Calvin is this rather simplified version of predestination, rather than, for example, his stunningly beautiful doctrine of sanctification, that is, how God changes people to be more like Christ, or maybe his nuanced understanding of the role of the law in the Christian life, or perhaps his deep understanding of prayer, it's not hard to see how this might predispose people to see Calvin as a tyrant in a rather black and white way. So then, let's dig a bit deeper into this perception that Calvin was a tyrant. I think the strongest two reasons that people have this perception of Calvin is really the program of discipline that Calvin instituted through the consistory, and secondly, as mentioned earlier, the infamous Servetus affair, which we'll address in the future. I mentioned in previous episodes that the consistory was a bit like the moral police, though it's perhaps a bit harsh to describe them that way. But the idea was that they were responsible for administering church discipline and Christian morality in the city. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, how well connected you are or not. If you get called out by the consistory, you're required to attend a session and to answer for your behaviour. And you could then be either admonished, which basically means told off and sort of encouraged to repent and change your ways. You could be suspended from communion at church for a time, or the worst punishment is that you could be excommunicated. In our postmodern Western context, it's hard to understand the power of excommunication because church and state have kind of been separated for so long. But if you are excommunicated in Calvin's Geneva, it means that you can't get married, participate in baptisms, carry out various kinds of business, or attend the Lord's Supper. So the profound social control that the consistory had over the lives of normal Genevans was significant. But it's important to remember that this is not a dictatorship. The consistory makes their decisions about punishment collectively, and people get called up for all sorts of things, whether that's drunkenness, blasphemy, Roman Catholic practices, adultery, and even dancing. It's safe to say that Calvin is not a fan of dancing. Bruce Gordon records a shocking incident in 1558 when a group of boys are actually, I'm sorry to say, beaten with sticks as a punishment for skipping catechism classes to play ice hockey. There are cases when the consistory positively intervenes on behalf of domestic violence victims, but then there are other times when they seem to recommend that rape victims should marry their attackers. Partly, I think, to try to protect the victim from falling into poverty, but still it's quite shocking to read that. the consistory are often brought in to help in cases of reconciliation. So if two neighbours hate each other and are fighting a lot, they'll try to bring both parties together to hammer it out. Or if it's reported that a married couple are arguing, they might step in to offer help in reconciliation. But as you can imagine, with this kind of stuff going on, there are people in Geneva who absolutely despise Calvin and hate the consistory. But there are also others, often fleeing religious persecution like John Knox, who come and find Geneva to be quite literally the best place they've ever lived. So back to the question, was John Calvin a tyrant? I think the evidence suggests absolutely not. Not only can you see this in the limitations the city council are keen to place on Calvin, but you can also see it in Calvin's character. He's a huge advocate of the principle that the Good Samaritan in the Bible, that Christians have an obligation to help the poor and the oppressed. And he regularly goes out on a limb to emphasize this to the wealthy power brokers of Geneva, who of course resent and hate him for doing that. If you look at the way Calvin repurposes and transforms the office of deacon in Geneva, again, it's remarkable. The deacons of Geneva basically offer the first early modern equivalent of the welfare state. And so there's no question in my mind that the poorest citizens of Geneva are way better off because of Calvin's leadership. So just to give you a flavour of that, listen to this from Gordon describing what the work of deacons. The deacons of the church, he says, did just about anything and everything. They purchased clothing and firewood, provided medical care, and not infrequently were present at births. They arranged guardians for the children of the sick. Essentially, they attempted to meet any need. Their task was thankless. The deacons had to respond immediately to whatever crisis landed at their doors. Can you imagine that? A sudden influx of refugees could arrive unannounced. They had to deal with difficult benefactors and recipients, and the records are full of the ingratitude of those whom they helped, as well as the hostility of locals. People often stole the items they were loaned, and violent threats against the deacons were not uncommon. So that sounds like a pretty thankless job, doesn't it? But it was Calvin's idea. And all of this is to say, Calvin cared far too much for the poor and the downtrodden to be fairly described as a tyrant, in my opinion. Are there things in Calvin's approach which are very much a product of his early modern context? Of course, and I've tried to be open about those things in this episode, but it's important that we're fair with regards to the fantastic things Calvin did do well, especially for the poor of Geneva. So that is to say, I don't think cancelling Calvin is a historically responsible or fair response to Calvin. If we apply the standards that we have today in the West to Calvin, then yes, of course, there are some things which might make for uncomfortable reading for us. But we in the modern West also have massive cultural blind spots which would have horrified Calvin. And actually, in 500 years, it's highly likely that there will be people looking back on us and judging us for the many things we do today, which we just assume are completely morally neutral and uncontroversial, but actually are not. So I think it's important that we read historical figures like Calvin with a certain degree of care and humility, and that this kind of silly stereotype of Calvin as this oppressive Pope of Geneva is thrown out for good. Thank you so much for listening. That feels like a good place to bring this particular episode into land, but stay tuned because next week we'll be seeing more of Calvin's human side, what it might have been like to be friends with Calvin, to be in his trusted inner circle. We're going to be looking at the popular idea that Calvin was this miserable killjoy, to see where that perception came from and what Calvin was actually like as a person. Super looking forward to that, and see you soon.